We tell children that monsters aren't real, that they only exist in nightmares. But what if the real monsters were the children themselves? Some of the youngest killers in history weren't just troubled, they were terrifying. These are not just kids. These are killers. Their crimes will haunt you forever. The first is Graham Young, a 14-year-old boy obsessed with poisons, experimented on his family, slowly poisoning them. He killed his stepmother and nearly killed his father and sister before being caught. After release, he continued poisoning people. It started with mild stomach aches, dizziness, and nausea. At first, no one thought much of it, just a bit of food poisoning or stomach bug. But day after day, the symptoms grew worse. They experienced weakness so severe they could barely stand. And then, one by one, they began to collapse. This wasn't an illness. This wasn't bad luck. This was murder. The culprit was not a stranger, not an outsider, but a boy, a teenager with a fascination so dark, so disturbing, that even the most seasoned investigators struggled to believe it. His name was Graham Young, and his weapon of choice was poison. Molly Young never knew what was happening to her. She only knew that, as the days passed, she was getting sicker and sicker. Her body betrayed her. She had constant vomiting, excruciating stomach pains, and doctors were baffled. And all the while, Graham watched, took notes, studied her suffering like a scientist observing an experiment. He didn't flinch at her agony. He relished it. By April 1962, Molly's condition had deteriorated to the point of no return. Hours later, she was dead. The doctors blamed natural causes, but it was anything but natural, because Graham Young had been poisoning her for months and no one suspected a thing. Born in 1947, Graham Young was not like other children. While other kids played football or collected comics, Graham had a different passion, which was poisons. By the age of 9, he was reading advanced chemistry books. By 10, he could recite the effects of cyanide and arsenic. His first test subjects were his own family. His father, his sister, his stepmother, all of them became unwilling participants in his twisted experiments. He laced their food, spiked their drinks, carefully measuring out doses to see just how much they could withstand. At first, they assumed it was bad luck, a stomach bug sweeping through the house. But as weeks turned into months, as the sickness grew more severe, the truth became impossible to ignore. One by one, Graham's family members began to notice a pattern. His sister, Winifred, suffered from sharp pains and bouts of vomiting so severe she thought she was dying. His father, Fred Young, grew weak, barely able to lift himself out of bed some mornings. And yet, Graham himself remained perfectly fine. Then came the notebooks. Hidden in Graham's room were detailed logs, pages upon pages of notes documenting his experiments. Every dose, every reaction, every symptom meticulously recorded like a scientist in a laboratory. Winifred found one of these notebooks, and when she read it, she realized the horrifying truth. Her own brother was poisoning them. Terrified, she confronted him. Graham denied nothing. Instead, he smiled and said, "Don't worry. I know what I'm doing." But she didn't believe him. She took the notebook to their father, and within hours, Graham was arrested. The trial was unlike anything Britain had seen before. A 14-year-old boy accused of poisoning his own family. A child with the mind of a killer. Psychiatrists examined Graham and came to a chilling conclusion. He had no remorse, no empathy, no regret. He saw humans suffering as nothing more than an interesting experiment. The judge had no choice but to act. Graham Young was sentenced to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric institution. They thought they were locking away a dangerous mind. But what they didn't realize was that they were sending him to a place where he would only become more dangerous. Surrounded by criminals and doctors, he had access to exactly what he wanted: more knowledge. He spent his time studying medical textbooks, learning about new poisons, refining his techniques. Then, the first death happened. One of the inmates, a fellow prisoner, suddenly collapsed. Symptoms eerily similar to those Graham's family had suffered. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but those who knew Graham suspected otherwise. Even in captivity, he had found a way to continue his experiments. But despite this, in 1971, after nearly a decade inside Broadmoor, Graham Young was released, The system believed he was reformed, that he had changed, that he had left his obsession behind. They were wrong. Within months of his release, Graham found a job as a lab technician. It was perfect. He had access to chemicals. No one questioned his knowledge. And best of all, he had new test subjects. Colleagues at the lab began falling ill. First, they had mild symptoms of nausea, dizziness, and stomach pains. Then, the symptoms grew more severe with internal bleeding and organ failure. The deaths started again. Graham's co-worker, Bob Eggle, was the first to die. Then, another Fred Biggs. Both had been suffering from mysterious ailments before their deaths. Once again, Graham kept meticulous notes. A fellow employee noticed something strange. Graham's obsessive interest in their symptoms, his odd comments about poisons, his eerie excitement whenever someone fell ill. The police were called and they searched his room. Inside, they found a collection of poisons, hidden bottles, and the same kind of detailed notebooks he had kept as a child. The truth was undeniable. Graham Young had never stopped killing. In 1972, Graham Young faced trial once more. This time, there was no escape. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of poisoning. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before delivering their verdict. He was guilty. Graham Young, the teenage poisoner who had fooled everyone, would never walk free again. Even in prison, Graham remained an enigma. He continued studying, continued writing, never showing a hint of remorse. Then, in 1990, at the age of 42, he died suddenly in his cell. Ironically, the cause of death was a heart attack. Some speculated that he had poisoned himself. Others believed his years of playing with deadly substances had finally caught up with him. Either way, Graham Young's reign of terror had come to an end. Next is Eric Smith, a 13-year-old boy who crushed a 4-year-old boy with a rock after strangling. On August 2, 1993, 4-year-old Derek Roby left his home like any other morning, ready to walk just a few blocks to his summer camp. It was a short, safe route, but somewhere along the way, he met a monster. Standing there, waiting, was 13-year-old Eric Smith, a boy just 9 years older than Derek. A boy who, in that moment, held a dark secret inside him, one that was about to explode into something unspeakable. Smith lured Derek off the path. He smiled, pretending to be friendly, but as soon as they were deep enough into the trees, his demeanor changed. What happened next was pure horror. Smith grabbed Derek by the neck, strangling him with his bare hands. He punched him, over and over, until the little boy's body went limp. But Smith wasn't finished. He picked up a heavy rock and brought it crashing down on Derek's skull. Once, twice, again and again, until the life was completely drained from his tiny body. And then, he did something even more disturbing. He stripped Derek of his shoes. He pulled down his shorts. And in a final act of cruelty, he violated the boy with a small stick. When he was done, Smith wiped his hands on Derek's lunch bag, throwing it aside and walked away. Derek's body was found hours later by camp counselors. His murder sent shockwaves through the small town of Savona, but the biggest shock was still to come. Just days after the killing, Eric Smith walked into the police station and confessed. Eric Smith was not the kind of child people feared. If anything, people pitied him. Born in 1980, he was bullied relentlessly. His bright red hair, thick glasses, and awkward demeanor made him a constant target at school. He was small for his age, isolated, and struggling with inner rage. But no one, not his parents, not his teachers, not even Eric himself, knew just how deep that rage ran. Psychologists later described Smith as a textbook case of a ticking time bomb. At his trial, the jury watched as this small, freckle-faced boy sat emotionless, recalling the brutal killing of a 4-year-old. He was sentenced to 9 years to life. Each time he applied for parole, he was denied, until 2021, when Eric Smith was released. Now, he walks free. But the question remains, can a child capable of such horror ever truly change? Eric Smith's crime was unthinkable, but he was not alone. Across history, there have been children whose darkness has defied explanation, and some were even younger than him. The next is Joshua Phillips. Phillips murdered his 8-year-old neighbor, Maddie Clifton, in a panic after accidentally hitting her with a baseball. Instead of seeking help, he beat and stabbed her, hiding her body under his bed for days. In a quiet Florida neighborhood, Maddie Clifton was the kind of child everyone adored, energetic and full of life. But one knock on the wrong door would change everything. Inside that house was 14-year-old Joshua Phillips, a boy who harbored a deadly secret. And for 6 days, no one knew. A frantic search was launched for Maddie Clifton. Neighbors, friends, even strangers joined in, desperate to find the missing 8-year-old. But no one thought to look in the one place that mattered most: Joshua Phillips' bed. 6 days after Maddie vanished, Joshua's mother made a horrifying discovery. She entered his room, noticing a strange foul smell. When she looked closer, she saw something she could never unsee: blood, a wet paddock seeping from under the bed. And then she lifted the mattress. There, wrapped in blankets, was the decomposing body of Maddie Clifton. Beaten, stabbed, hidden in plain sight. He claimed it was an accident and that Maddie had come over to play, and during a roughhousing game, he accidentally struck her in the eye with a baseball. Panicked that she would tell his parents, he dragged her inside. But instead of helping her, he made a choice that turned him into a monster. Phillips grabbed a baseball bat and began striking Maddie over and over, silencing her screams. Then, in a moment of horrifying finality, he took a knife and stabbed her multiple times. When it was over, he stuffed her lifeless body under his bed and went on with life as if nothing had happened. When his mother found Maddie's body, there was no denying what had happened. Joshua Phillips was arrested immediately. At trial, he pleaded that the murder was not premeditated, that fear had driven him to kill. But the jury saw the truth. This was no accident. It was a brutal, calculated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Now, Joshua Phillips sits behind bars, a child killer who fooled everyone until his darkest secret could no longer be hidden. Next on our list is John Venables and Robert Thompson, a pair of 10-year-olds who abducted 2-year-old James Bulger from a shopping center. They tortured and beat him to death, leaving his body on train tracks. Their crime shocked the world due to its sheer brutality. On February 12, 1993, a normal day at the New Strand shopping center. Parents shop, children laugh, and in the middle of it all, 2 10-year-old boys are about to commit an act so shocking, so brutal, that it will haunt an entire nation. The victim was a little boy, a 2-year-old child named James Bulger. They called it a kidnapping, but what happened next was so much worse. At 3:42 p.m., James Bulger wandered just a few steps away from his mother while she was distracted at a butcher's shop counter. That was all it took. That one moment of separation. John Venables and Robert Thompson were waiting. They had spent the entire afternoon at the shopping center, not buying toys or playing video games like other kids, but looking for a child to take. And when they saw James, they seized their opportunity. They walked up to him, smiled, took his tiny hand, and without hesitation, led him away. At first, no one noticed. Passersby assumed they were James's older brothers. They were just 3 children walking together, disappearing into the streets of Liverpool. But this was no ordinary walk. It was a march toward horror. For over 2 miles, John Venables and Robert Thompson dragged James Bulger across the city. He cried for his mother. He resisted and stumbled. But each time, they pulled him forward. Along the way, nearly 40 people saw them. Some noticed James was crying. Others saw his bruises, injuries the boys had already inflicted. But no one intervened. No one thought 2 10-year-old boys could be capable of evil. By the time they reached an abandoned railway track, James was exhausted, disoriented, and completely at their mercy. It was here that John Venables and Robert Thompson carried out their final act of cruelty. They began by torturing James. They threw paint into his eyes and kicked him, threw bricks at his tiny body. Then, they found a 22-pound iron bar, and with sickening force, they brought it crashing down on James's skull. Once, twice, over and over again. By the time they were finished, James was unrecognizable. His small body was so battered that forensic pathologists couldn't determine the exact number of blows he suffered. But it was enough to end his life. John Venables and Robert Thompson had done the unthinkable. They had murdered a toddler in cold blood. And then, They simply walked away. James's body was left on the tracks, his broken frame placed in such a way that when a train came, it would look like an accident. But this was no accident. This was murder. And the killers? They were just children themselves. James Bulger was reported missing immediately. The entire city searched for him, but no one could imagine the horror that was about to unfold. 2 days later, on February 14th, a group of teenagers discovered something near the train tracks. Something small, something lifeless. It was James, his body torn apart. The discovery shocked Britain. Who could do something like this? Who could be so cruel? When police reviewed the CCTV footage, they saw it clearly. The last image of James Bulger alive, holding hands with 2 unknown boys. The country demanded justice. The manhunt was massive. At first, the police thought they were looking for teenagers. No one believed that 2 10-year-olds could commit such a monstrous act, but the truth was undeniable. Someone recognized John Venables from the footage. The police brought him in. At first, Venables denied everything. But as the questions pressed on, his defenses broke. And then, the confession came. "We did it," he whispered. "We killed him." Robert Thompson was cold and calculating. Denied everything at first. For the first time, the British public saw the faces behind the crime. The faces of 2 boys who had taken the life of a toddler and shown no remorse. The evidence was overwhelming. The CCTV footage, the witness statements, and the forensic reports. On November 24, 1993, John Venables and Robert Thompson were found guilty of murder. They became the youngest people convicted of murder in the UK in over a century. The judge called their crime unparalleled evil. They were sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, essentially, an indefinite prison sentence with the possibility of release. In 2001, after serving just 8 years, John Venables and Robert Thompson were released. They were given new identities, new homes, and fresh start. A chance to rebuild their lives while James Bulger's family was left with nothing but grief. Robert Thompson disappeared from the public eye. There have been no reported crimes, no arrests. He has, it seems, managed to live a quiet life. John Venables, however, was a different story. He struggled. He violated his parole. In 2010, he was caught with child pornography on his computer, images of abuse, images of suffering. And once again, he was sent to prison. In 2018, it happened again. More child pornography and horror. John Venables was sentenced once more, proving that some people never change. The murder of James Bulger remains one of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. Not just because of its brutality, but because of who committed it. Next is Craig Price. On September 4, 1989, a peaceful home on Buttonwoods Avenue. 4 people asleep, locked away in what should have been safety. But lurking in the shadows was a monster. Joan Heaton, the mother, lay in her bedroom stabbed 57 times. Her daughters, Jennifer, aged 10, and Melissa, aged 8, had suffered the same fate. Slashed, mutilated, their small bodies destroyed by a level of rage the police had never seen before. Blood coated the walls, the floors, the very air smelled of death. But what horrified investigators the most was the sheer brutality of it. The killer hadn't just murdered them, he had butchered them, stabbed them over and over again, far beyond what was needed to kill. Craig Price was just 15 years old, a high school student, a football player, a neighborhood kid who joked with friends and helped carry groceries for elderly neighbors. But behind the mask of normalcy was a monster, because Craig Price wasn't just responsible for the Heaton murders. He had done this before. 2 years earlier, in 1987, Craig Price had taken his first life. He was only 13. His victim was a neighbor, 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer. She was home alone when Craig broke in. He found a knife, and without hesitation, he attacked. Rebecca was stabbed 58 times. Her body left on the floor of her own home. Her life stolen by a boy barely old enough to understand death. For 2 years, the murder went unsolved. Police never imagined that the killer was a child, and as time passed, Craig Price grew more confident, more comfortable with killing. Then, in 1989, he struck again, this time, wiping out an entire family. After detectives searched the crime scene, evidence led to Craig Price. When officers arrived at his house, They noticed fresh cuts on his hand, signs of a struggle. Then came the biggest breakthrough. During questioning, Craig laughed, smirked, bragged about what he had done. And when they searched his room, they found the final piece of evidence were bloody clothes, hidden in a bag, soaked in the lives he had taken. Because of his age, he couldn't be tried as an adult. He couldn't face life in prison or the death penalty. Instead, under state law, he would be released at 21, no matter how brutal his crimes. The public was outraged. How could a boy who had killed 4 people, 2 of them children, be allowed to walk free in just a few years? But the law was clear. Craig Price would serve time in a juvenile facility, and then he would be released, unless someone found a way to stop him. So they found a loophole. Instead of focusing on his past murders, they charged him with new crimes: assaults on prison guards, violent outbursts, possession of weapons behind bars. Each time he got close to release, another charge was added. Another sentence was extended, and year after year, Craig Price remained behind bars. Today, he is still in prison, not for the murders but for the violence that followed. Pauline Parker and Juliet Hulme were teenage best friends whose obsessive relationship led them to commit a brutal murder. Fearing they would be separated by Juliet's impending move to South Africa, they plotted and executed the murder of Pauline's mother, Honora Parker, by luring her to a secluded park and bludgeoning her to death with a brick. The case became one of New Zealand's most infamous crimes, inspiring the 1994 film Heavenly Creatures. Pauline Parker was a 16-year-old girl living in Christchurch, New Zealand. Juliet Hulme was 15. They met at school and formed an immediate and intense friendship. To the outside world, their bond seemed innocent enough to young girls in a world of books, imagination, and shared dreams. But behind closed doors, their relationship had grown into something far more unhealthy. However, what was at the core of this bond was a shared sense of escape from the realities of their lives. Pauline's home life was oppressive. Her mother was controlling and harsh, while Juliet's family had their own issues. Juliet's family was set to move to South Africa, which was the catalyst for what would soon transpire. She would leave Pauline behind, a thought that Pauline couldn't bear. To Pauline, losing Juliet was unthinkable. Pauline and Juliet began to discuss their options, growing increasingly convinced that Honora was the problem, the one obstacle preventing them from staying together. They were, in their minds, justifiable in their belief that Honora was a threat to their relationship and happiness. The girls lured Honora to Victoria Park on June 22, 1954, promising to take her to a special spot in the park. There, they would kill her. The day of the murder was overcast, the air thick with tension as the trio made their way through the park. They had brought with them a brick concealed in Pauline's bag, a tool that would become the instrument of murder. Once they reached a secluded spot, the girls attacked. Honora, realizing too late what was happening, was struck repeatedly with the brick. Honora fell to the ground, unable to fight back as Pauline and Juliet continued to strike her. The murder was brutal, the violence extreme. But what followed would be even more chilling. After Honora was dead, the girls did not flee in panic. Instead, they stayed with the body, altering it. The investigation into Honora Parker's death started slowly. There were no witnesses, and the crime scene was eerily clean. But the girls' actions after the murder were suspicious. They began acting strange, distancing themselves from their families and avoiding the police's questions. Eventually, they broke under the pressure. Pauline and Juliet confessed to the murder, claiming they had killed Honora to stop her from separating them. During the trial period, psychiatrists examined both girls. They described them as highly intelligent, but emotionally immature. They had a dangerous capacity for manipulation and an unsettling ability to detach from the reality of their crime. The court found both girls guilty of murder. However, because of their age, they were not sentenced to death. Instead, they were sentenced to prison. They would serve time in a girls' institution. Pauline was sentenced to 5 years, while Juliet received the same. After serving their sentences, both girls were released in 1959, when they were still teenagers. They were given new identities as part of their rehabilitation and their criminal records were sealed from public view. Pauline eventually married and had children, while Juliet went on to have a successful career as a writer, but the shadow of their crime never fully left them. The case of Pauline Parker and Juliet Hulme is one that haunts the public consciousness. Jesse Pomeroy, nicknamed the Boy Fiend, Pomeroy started by torturing other children before escalating to murder. At just 14, he was convicted of killing a 4-year-old and a 10-year-old in gruesome ways. Jesse Pomeroy wasn't an ordinary child. From the moment he could walk, something about him was off. Born in 1859, he came into the world with a disturbing appearance. One eye white and clouded, as if touched by something unnatural. Other children feared him. Adults kept their distance. By the time Jesse was 11, children in the neighborhood began to disappear. Not for long, just for hours at a time. But when they returned, they were changed, bruised, bloodied, broken. They spoke of a boy as a demon in human form who lured them away, tied them up, and inflicted pain beyond words. He used knives, needles, sharp stones, anything he could get his hands on. He would beat them, slice their skin, force them to endure pain for hours before letting them crawl back home if they were lucky. For months, the city was gripped by fear. Parents warned their children to stay close. Until one day, a boy escaped. He ran bleeding, screaming, until he found help. And when he described his attacker, the police knew exactly who it was. Jesse was arrested in 1872, when he was just 12 years old. At his trial, he showed no remorse, no fear, only the same eerie smirk he always wore. The court sentenced him to reform school, a place where troubled boys were sent to be corrected. Authorities believed he would change. That discipline would fix whatever was broken inside him. They were wrong, because just over a year later, Jesse Pomeroy was free. And within weeks of his release, he killed for the first time. 10-year-old Katie Curran was running an errand for her mother when she vanished. Her parents searched for days. Flyers were posted. The whole neighborhood was on alert. But Katie was nowhere to be found. Weeks later, while investigating another crime, police stumbled upon something horrifying: a trapdoor in the basement of a local shop. When they lifted it, the stench hit them first. The unmistakable smell of death. And there, beneath the floorboards, was Katie's body, slashed, stabbed, left to rot in the darkness. And the owner of that shop? Jesse Pomeroy's own mother. The pieces fell into place. Jesse had killed Katie Curran, and not long after, he had murdered 4-year-old Horace Millen. 2 victims. But how many more had suffered at his hands? It was time to stop the Boy Fiend for good. Jesse's trial was like nothing Boston had ever seen. Crowds packed the courtroom. Newspapers called him the Boy Fiend, a creature, not a child. Psychiatrists examined him. They found no guilt, no empathy, no emotion at all. His only explanation for what he had done: "I couldn't help myself." The jury took just minutes to find him guilty. And though many demanded the death penalty, the law was clear: Jesse was too young to be executed. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison. Jesse Pomeroy would never see freedom again. Locked away in solitary confinement, he spent decades in a small, windowless cell. Even in prison, he remained defiant. He tried to escape multiple times. He attacked guards. He even attempted to burn his cell to the ground. But as the years passed, the world forgot about him. He lived in darkness, died in obscurity, a monster locked away until there was nothing left of him but his legend. Mary Bell murdered 2 young boys, 4-year-old Martin Brown and 3-year-old Brian Howe, in cold blood. She strangled them and even returned to mutilate Howe's body with scissors. She showed no remorse and even taunted the victims' families. In Newcastle, England, 1968, a quiet working-class neighborhood where children played in the streets, and parents felt safe letting them roam. But that safety was an illusion, because among those children was something far worse than anyone imagined. An 11-year-old girl with a taste for death. Her name was Mary Bell, and in the span of 2 months, she would become Britain's youngest killer. May 25, 1968. 4-year-old Martin Brown left his house to play. He never came back. Hours later, he was found in an abandoned house, his small body lying lifeless on the floor. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, just the eerie stillness of a child who had stopped breathing. At first, Authorities believed it was a tragic accident, a fall perhaps. The very next day, a group of children broke into a nursery school nearby. Desks were overturned, papers scattered, and on the walls, there were chilling messages scrawled in a child's handwriting. I murder so that I may come back. We did murder Martin Brown because Martin Brown's death was no accident, and the girl responsible wasn't done yet. On July 31st, 1968, just 2 months after Martin Brown's death, another child disappeared. 3-year-old Brian Howe was last seen playing outside his house. When his family realized he was missing, a frantic search began. Hours later, his tiny body was discovered in a patch of wasteland. This time, there was no question this was murder. Brian had been strangled. His lips were blue. His arms bore tiny bruises, marks left by small fingers squeezing the life out of him. But what made it worse was what happened after he died. Whoever had killed Brian had returned to his body, not in panic, not to hide it, but to mutilate it. His hair had been cut. Strange symbols had been carved into his chest with scissors. She showed up at Martin Brown's house just days after his death and asked his grieving mother a chilling question. "Do you miss Martin?" When the woman nodded, Mary smirked and added, "I just wanted to see him in his coffin." At Brian Howe's funeral, Mary Bell stood among the mourners, watching with unsettling fascination. When questioned, she asked police, "Do you think the killer's hands would be small, like a girl's?" Then, a witness came forward. He had seen Mary and her friend, 13-year-old Norma Bell, playing with Brian on the day he vanished. More importantly, he had seen them leaving the scene where his body was later found. Police brought both girls in for questioning. Norma crumbled, but Mary did not. She laughed, denied everything, and twisted her words to confuse investigators. But in December 1968, Mary Bell stood trial for the murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe. While Norma was acquitted, Mary was found guilty of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. The judge described her as dangerously abnormal and sentenced her to detainment at Her Majesty's pleasure. Mary was released in 1980 at just 23 years old. She was given a new identity and later had a daughter. When reporters exposed her past, the government granted her lifelong anonymity. Today, she still walks free, but the families of her victims, they live with a different reality. These cases remind us that evil can manifest in even the most unexpected forms. Childhood, meant to be a time of innocence, can sometimes conceal darkness beyond comprehension. As we reflect on these stories, we're left to question what truly shapes a child's soul.